I want to readdress our central program, which is philosophy. And there was, as I mentioned to Laurel or suggested to Laurel, there was a couple of or several actual topics that deserve um, some follow up. And I've it's been bothering me all week, but I'm not sure I can handle them all. The thing about Plato is that it's not untrue, as Alfred North Whitehead said, that everything that happens after Plato is just a footnote. That's not an exaggeration. And so when we're covering Plato, it's kind of like you're covering the entire 2,000 years since, because all of these, there are very few issues that haven't been suggested by Plato that somebody else thinks of later. And so it's easy to get uh, started in a discussion of something that he said that maybe we'll cover later and maybe we'll never cover because we're just not going to have time to do everything we want to do. Anyway, there are a couple of things that I wanted to address. One, I'll hold for Laurel, but I think Meredith was, I see she's joining us. Meredith was interested in too. I want to make clear that we're talking about the theory of recollection, and I was mentioning that Chomsky and Jung were among modern theorists who pick up on this theme in different ways. Of course, Jung with the collective unconscious and Chomsky with universal grammar. And what we got talking about last time was the deficits that happen to children who are not well cared for in early life and how this can affect their development of language. This is not really what Chomsky's about. In other words, neither Plato nor Chomsky want to say that if you just had some, wolf child, somebody that had never been introduced to civilization, he would develop language on his own because of recollection. Nobody is arguing that, and certainly not Chomsky. In fact, it's kind of the reverse, which is that what he wants to say is that even if you have every possible exposure to language at an early age and a safe environment and all that, what he says is that that still will not account for the child's ability to learn grammar at such a quick pace. And this is true in all societies. That's another thing. If there were a universal language, then everybody would end up speaking the same thing, which is, of course, not the case. But all children in all societies learn how to speak. And if you think about how weird of a thing speech is compared to all other animals, most animals, well, we don't know what they're communicating, but as far as we know, the kind of things they communicate, if you take bird song, are, this is me, don't mess with me, I'm looking for a mate, there's some kind of danger, that kind of signal. In other words, it's something to do with a threat or a challenge or looking for a mate or something like that. But words, I can say a word like tree, and it has nothing to do with anything of the sort. It's not a challenge to me. It's not something I'm threatened by. I'm not expressing pain or fear or anything like that. I'm just saying tree, and it's just some sound I make, and you know what it means. But there's not even a tree in this room, but I said tree, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. Or I could be talking about something that doesn't exist, like a fairy, and we know what that means. And what Chomsky says is he has something called merge. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I really want, but he has something called merge. And what it is you have, say, a noun and another noun. like say Sally and Tim. Uh, and so you can say those two things and put them together in a merge. So if I say Sally and Tim, I know that there's two different people. And then if I add he, it's reiterative. So then I can add another merge, which is um, are running. So there's another element. So Sally and Tim is say the subject, and then I go are running. That's a verb, and so that's another merge that I'm making between. This is the word that Chomsky uses, merge. It's not something I made up. So and then it just reiterates, and in a manner not totally dissimilar from, I suppose you all had to diagram sentences when you were in school. I did anyway. And it's a way of teaching grammar. Well, uh, that's not exactly what Chomsky does, but it's sort of like that, how he merges different elements and they all come together to mean something. And what he wants to say is that a child does not have enough of a sample to have learned that by the time they are, say, 2 or 3 years old, to have learned the structure. Now, another comparison that would work would be um, large language models. And what large language models do is they don't know anything about the world and they don't know anything about grammar. You just spew billions and billions of sentences at them and they will recognize patterns. And so the simple example is a barrel full of, and if you are an LLM, you can look at all the literature in the world, and what's the most likely word to come after a barrel full of? Well, it's monkeys. It's not giraffes. And so that's how it's simple as that. It's just massive number crunching that allows LLMs to come up with what the next word is. And even though it appears to have a grammar, it doesn't really. It doesn't, nobody has taught it this is how words go together, and this is a noun and this is a verb. It just knows that this is, and this is the same thing with, say, self-driving cars. They just let them loose and they see what patterns are followed by normal drivers, and they have billions of miles to crunch in their supercomputers, and then the car gets an idea of what you normally do when you see this stoplight, right? Anyway, the child, according to Chomsky, does not have enough data like a supercomputer or an LLM to have arrived at an understanding of what the pattern of grammar should be in a sentence. And yet they display, they know what, if you say daddy's not here, they know who daddy is and they know what not here is. And so they figured out this merge on the basis of apparently following their appearance use of words. And yet, according to Chomsky, they just don't have enough data to have actually arrived at how that language is put together. Another example that Laurel mentioned, I think, is she come back? Yeah, Laurel, you mentioned about deficits that can occur because of a brain injury. And I also mentioned songbirds have a window before which and after which they can't learn the song of their species. And so what this indicates in both cases, the brain damage, is that there is a mechanism in the brain that allows the animal to comprehend in a way. It's not maybe the same with birds, but comprehend what's going on. And if that is damaged, even though random words or random visualizations can occur to them, they can't construct something that's a sentence. And so there probably is something physiological in the human brain that developed for God knows what reason that allows us to assemble, as Chomsky says, these various merges and eventually come up with this very elaborate system called language. And how this relates to Plato is Plato also observes that there must be some kind of structure, unifying structure that the brain intuits in order to understand things. And I wanted to relate this, if I may, to Anne. Peter's not back yet, but Anne, you mentioned something about justice not being
Peter
served.
is here. Peter
Oh,
is
okay, good. Justice not being served in Mississippi, if I remember right.
right.
Now, the question is, how do you learn what justice is? This would be the Platonic question. Doug, do you have something to ask? You're muted. Doug, you're muted. Turn on your mic. We can't hear you.
You're muted.
You're muted. Oh, there you go.
What was the Greek Plato's concept of the brain?
Oh, yeah. I don't think Plato even knew that the thing in your head was your brain. Aristotle, I think, thought it was in the heart. The organ was in the heart that comprehended the universe. So they didn't have, certainly Plato and Aristotle didn't have a good concept of anatomy, and certainly nothing about neurology or anything like that.
Just a little interjection on that. The Egyptians had a description that was fairly accurate of Alzheimer's disease. And their explanation was that the heart was worn out and could no longer, that the heart was the seat of memory. And I'm sure I can't, Hotep or something, whatever, I won't try to, has a description of his own onset of memory problems that they attribute, in fact, to the heart. So neither the Egyptians nor the Greeks had a sense of this. However, just for what it's worth, there's an entire journal devoted to brain, at least one journal devoted to brain and language that is trying to, using very, very high level imaging techniques and other techniques to connect what the neural structure, underlying structure is that underlies language and makes it possible, and then how deficiencies in it, either in developmental deficiencies or in aphasia or adult onset problems, are connected with specific damage to the cells or to the connections, the wiring. Anyway, I'm sorry about the digression, but.
So Doug, yeah.
No, it just occurs to me that, I mean, people weren't stupid, obviously, historically, and they paid an awful lot of attention to the cosmos and knew an awful lot about astronomy. Don't you think over a couple of thousand years that they would have figured out, through brain injuries and different things like that, that there's something going on up in your head? I mean, I'm just
evidently not. As Laurel said, I think even Aristotle, who was somebody who actually concentrated on things like anatomy, as opposed to Plato. Plato's more of I describe the difference in Plato and Aristotle as Plato thinks you learn from the top down, and Aristotle thinks you learn from the bottom up. In other words, and the picture that I mentioned, I think before, of Raphael, of the School of Athens, which is Plato and Aristotle walking side by side, that hangs in the Vatican. If you look at the posture of both of them, Plato is gesturing up and Aristotle's gesturing down. And that's supposed to symbolize the fact that Aristotle is learning from the world, from his perceptions, and Plato is learning from the forms, which are not physical and not available to perception. Now, geez, what was I saying?
Sorry.
No.
Well, what were you going to ask Peter?
Well, let me see if I can remember what I was just going to say about. Yeah. Oh yeah, Plato. Just the forms that are. Oh, it was Anne. Your statement about justice not being served. The question is, where do you get your sense of justice? And Plato would say, you never observe justice, so how could you learn what justice is? in order to be able to criticize the justice that you see, unless you already had a picture of what justice was, because I think we'd all agree that we've never seen perfect justice, and you never will see perfect justice. And from that, Plato wants to say that you must have gotten it from someplace else. And I think this will possibly segue into Peter's question, one of Peter's questions, which was, let me see if I can recall this. Just a second. Let's see. Well, one of his concerns was about the Republic, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But
I said I thought the definition of justice at the end of the Republic is a valuable thing in a way, but not a sufficient definition of justice.
okay, yeah, we're going to definitely get to that. The other thing is that I did make a note of it here. Let's see. The argument, Peter, the specific thing you brought up was that you were talking about the arguments for the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo, and you weren't impressed. And you said, but if you accept his premise, then the argument is not refutable. But the thing is, you don't have to accept his premise.
No, you don't.
You know, so
it's like the ontological argument for the existence of God.
It is.
Once you step onto that platform, it takes you where it takes you.
That's right. So the argument in the Meno, which we discussed in your absence, the argument from the Meno is that the slave boy exhibits this ability to figure out a geometric problem, having never had any geometry. So where did he learn it? And that's the question Plato addresses. And Socrates answers it by saying, well, poets in the past, this is a typical Platonic move, poets in the past have said, now Plato's himself not, of course, divorced from the world of mythology that he's grown up with. Every schoolboy would have learned Homer, including Plato. So he's surrounded by all this mythology, but he doesn't, the difference is that he and the pre-Socratics don't rely on mythology to explain things. But Plato from time to time is fond of bringing it up, saying, well, people in the ancient times thought that this. So anyway, the argument in the Meno, which we discussed last time in your absence, is that we don't know how the slave boy comes up with his geometry. We don't know that. And I'm going to guess that it's some kind of recollection from a former life. At the end of the Republic, Plato tells you what the process of rebirth is. It's the myth of that you see in the last book of the Republic. And it's pretty sketchy, but that's a myth Plato tells in his characteristic way of saying, well, it could be this. This is called an argumentum ad ignorantiam, and it's something we're going to run into again in Aquinas. But the difference between Aquinas and Plato is an argument from ignorance is what it is. And there are two main forms of this. One is, you can't prove me wrong, so I'm right. That's an argument from ignorance. The other one is, we don't know what caused this, so it must have been, and then fill in the blank. It must have been aliens. It must have been a previously unknown advanced ancient civilization. It must have been God. And those are the three most common conclusions that you come to using the argumentum ad ignorantium. This is the Latin name for the fallacy that in logic we say that. So you're not advancing any evidence, positive evidence that shows what you said is true. What you're doing is saying, well, I can't explain it, so it must be this. And so Plato is essentially using that argument. He doesn't make a point of it, but other people do. He doesn't say, Plato's too clever for that. He just says, well, I don't know, but it could be what this old guy said. That's how Plato handles these things. And that's because he's subtle. He's not an idiot, and he knows he doesn't have evidence for the answer. But on the other hand, it's a puzzle that he can't answer. And so, and getting back to your justice thing, how do you know what justice is if you never see it around you? That would be the Platonic question. How do you know what it is? And Plato wants to say, well, we have some kind of recollection of what perfect justice is. And there's not a good answer to that. Can you think of one? If you'd been trained on justice, like every lawyer here has been, would you say that, and you learned all that, were there times when you studied cases where you knew the outcome wasn't just, and you'd say, yeah, I'm sure that's the case. So how do you know that? And this is a very, very complicated problem and will be with us for the whole term, but it is a question that it has no easy resolution, is what I want to say.
Two things. One, I'm not averse to the argument that the idea of justice is somehow inherent in us. But if you want to make a kind of empirical argument, you could say, well, within the family, people may be treated justly and they have some idea of what justice is, and they know that the police are not following that idea, for example. You know, that is at least an empirical route by which you could learn something about justice, even in a state where the government was unjust or the law was unjust.
Well, except that you could grow up in a family that was racist. And so, and
Yeah.
then you
But
could,
if
as
you
a,
grew up in a family where there was no sense of justice at all, would you,
yeah.
be able to access that inherent idea, even if it's there?
And I think all of us have disagreed with our parents, probably at an early age, about what was right and wrong. I know I did.
Yeah.
That and you, to this day, I'm quite sure that none of you absolutely follow every one of your parents' rules, and have done so throughout life. I'd be surprised if that were the case. So anyway, the doctrine of recollection is a very central Platonic doctrine, and a very mysterious one, and yet very difficult to dismiss as saying, well, that's not a problem. We know, but Aristotle did. When we get to Aristotle would say, no, we learn everything from observe. He would say we learn justice from observing the good people in our society, which I would say, Aristotle, that begs the question who the good people in the society are. I mean, how can you say you've learned it? But anyway, I'm certainly more in the Platonic school than Aristotle, but there are people who think Aristotle is a better philosopher because they can't bring themselves to believe that we have any kind of mysterious innate knowledge. And that would be the empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. They say, no, there's no such thing. We learn everything from experience. I think even in Laurel's field, that is not, in other words, she's an empirical scientist. And I think even in the realm of empirical scientists, there's a lot of mysteries that can't be explained by observation so far.
Absolutely. But I did send you a copy of an article, send everybody, I hope it got to everybody, a review of the evidence for the early development of a sense of justice, that there appears to be some sort of foundation for learning about it and its components. So Tony, I will be really interested. It claims that there are 4 foundational aspects: impartiality, agency, obligatoriness, and conflicting claims. Anyway,
this is just again, I want to move
go off
forward.
on a tangent, but I'm really interested that Plato was by logic or an argument rather than observing people's brains or child development or whatever. He's coming up with hypotheses about where things come from that can be examined by
Well,
more of
exactly, but what do those words mean, and where'd you get the meanings for them?
I don't know. That's what I wanted. That's what I'm
That
sending this along for.
that would be the Platonic question. How do you know what I can't remember. Give me one of those terms again. What were the terms you told us?
Um,
Impartiality.
Agency,
impartiality.
Okay.
obligatory.
Where do you get the concept of impartiality? Do you get that from? I would say people can't. That's a hard concept to teach somebody. You just kind of have. Anyway, I don't want to get too far sidetracked.
Infants process what they observe. They observe things, but they also process it with whatever presumably hardware they're equipped with, if you will, brain.
Well, okay, that would be the Platonic idea, and I'm sure that science will, in the future, have more information to go from, but right now we certainly don't. And Plato was right to point out that it's a mystery to us. Okay, I want to start talking about the Republic and some of the central teachings of Plato that we can take forward. And I want to re-emphasize that I can't emphasize enough that Plato never says any of these things. These are always in somebody else's mouth. And the most important doctrines are not only in somebody else's mouth, they're also by that person, namely Socrates, attributed to somebody else. And this reaches a complete ridiculous level in the symposium, which we're going to read. Anyway, ridiculous is a wrong word. Genius is another word for it. But anyway, the Republic, what I wanted to mention to Peter, and then this will conclude the things I wanted to bring to his attention because of things that he mentioned before. Let's see if I can get these up here. In the Republic, now, okay, the Republic starts out, well, we're not reading that, but you can read it if you want. The Republic starts out with a discussion of what is justice, and they're a couple of Plato's brothers are there, and an old guy named Cephalus, and they talk about and a sophist named Thrasymachus, who believes justice is the interest of the stronger, and his arguments will be repeated in another dialogue called the Gorgias by a character named Callicles. Both Thrasymachus and Callicles together are previewing the teachings of Nietzsche a couple of millennia later, but they're in Plato. Anyway, so the first book, many scholars think that the first book is just a typical Socratic dialogue ending in, we don't know what justice is, right? That kind of thing. But then this is where we think Plato has his fingers in the pie and he's going to add his theories to it. And I want to read you what Socrates says in the, I think it's the second book. It's the second book, and he's talking about justice and how we're going to define it. Let me read this to you. Glaucon's a brother of Plato, and the rest entreated me by all means not to let the question drop, but to proceed in the investigation. They wanted to arrive at the truth first about the nature of justice and injustice, and secondly, about their relative advantages. I told them what I really thought, that the inquiry would be of a serious nature and would require a very, very good eye. Seeing then, I said, that we are no great wits, I think we had better adopt a method which may illustrate this. But suppose that a short-sighted person had been asked by somebody to read small letters from a distance. Let me cut to the chase here. He says we ought to magnify the problem, and very true, said Adimantus, who's another brother of Plato. But how does the illustration apply to our inquiry? I'll tell you. Justice, which is the subject of our inquiry, is, as you know, sometimes spoken of as the virtue of an individual and sometimes as the virtue of a state. Is not a state larger than an individual? It is. Then in the larger quantity of justice is likely to be a larger and more easily discernible. in the justice is likely to be more easily discernible. I propose, therefore, that we inquire into the nature of justice and injustice, first as they appear in the state, and secondly in the individual, proceeding from the greater to the lesser. Now, he says this in book 2, but then at the end of book 9, he says, I understand. He'll be a ruler in a city of which we are the founders and which exists in idea only, for I do not believe that there is such a one anywhere on earth. In heaven, I replied, there is laid up a pattern of it, methinks, which he who desires may behold, and beholding may set his own house in order. But whether such one exists or ever will exist is no matter, for he will live in the matter of that city, having nothing to do with any other. Okay. This frames the entire body of the Republic. I'm very tempted to say the mainstream media never tells you this, but the entire Republic, all of the stuff where he describes the entire government, is a thought experiment framed by those two statements. Socrates says, well, in order to understand justice in the individual, let's blow it up to the whole society, which is a macrocosm to our microcosm, and we will, by blowing it up, have a better view of what justice is. And then at the end, he says, nothing like this has ever existed or may ever exist, but this is how you'll rule yourself. Now, I don't want to make too much of this because I'm sure that Plato did mean many of the things he said about how the just state is organized. However, I don't think it's wise to ignore this setup. Plato's not a sloppy writer. He didn't put this in there for no reason. So he says, Socrates says, I'm going to make a thought experiment here, and we're going to examine the whole state. And then you should run your own mind and your own soul after this pattern, after we've discovered it in a magnified form in the state. All right. Now, the by itself, the Republic is a massive piece of work, and you may have all read it. We could easily spend 2 months just talking about all the stuff in the Republic, but we're not going to do that because we have lives to live. And the Republic is only part of what Plato wrote. So, I mean, if you want to discuss all of Plato, then you can spend a couple of months in the Republic and then get busy on all the rest of it. So it's not everything there is to know the Republic. So I want to just point out a few things. The most famous thing in the Republic is the myth of the cave. I'm not very fond of this myth just because it's so generic. It's not really Platonic. I mean, MAGA people could use the myth of the cave, say, well, if you come into the light, in fact, Steve Bannon said something like this about Elon Musk. He said something very parallel to this. He said, well, if you once you get what we're on, then you'll have to do some study. And, it was just ridiculous. And it was this idea of an enlightenment that's out there for you to reach. But most of us poor slobs are staring at a wall that's showing shadows of shapes that are caused by a fire behind us. That's what most of the hoi polloi or most of hoi polloi, the and hoi mean the same thing. Most of hoi polloi are doing is just living in darkness with illusions and shadows of reality. I don't like that. I mean, you could just use it for anything. You could use it for Buddhism. You could use it for Islam. That's the reason I don't like it. It's fine as a kind of allegory of enlightenment, but it's too generic. Whereas Plato isn't that generic. And I would one of the other myths he refers to, or metaphors or allegories, is the myth of the sun, which is more like Plato, more specific to Plato. And the myth of the sun, I think have already mentioned. But the myth of the sun is that this is in the Republic. That's why I'm bringing it up. The myth of the sun is that the eye is to the sun as the mind is to the forms. And so Plato sees that the mind of the human being is able to comprehend the substance of the universe, the structure of the universe in every way, the aesthetic structure, the physical structure, the moral structure, through the mind, the same way the eye is able to perceive the perceived world, because it's designed to do that, as it were. Plato doesn't use the word design, but it's structured to do that. The eye can see the world and the mind can see the structure of the universe. And I think I mentioned that this is a kind of mysticism that's different from what we're used to thinking of as mystics, like Meister Eckhart or Saint Teresa or the Buddha, or anybody that goes into a trance-like state and feels that one, or George Harrison, feels within you and without you, feels the universe is within you and you're at one with the universe. That's not the kind of approach to mysticism Plato has. He does think the universe is within you and without you, but he approaches it from an entire analytic and empirical way. And the demonstration is the slave boy in the Meno. The slave boy in the Meno, by the way, that demonstration is not copied or ever repeated in the whole history of philosophy. There is no equivalent demonstration of any other philosophical principle in the entire history of philosophy, other than that slave boy demonstration by Plato. So another thing that is implied by many of the things I've just said is that Plato is a dualist. He is the father of all dualism, as it were. The two most famous dualists in philosophy are Plato and Descartes. Descartes had the mind-body dualism, and Plato has the world of forms and the world of perception. Those are his two areas. And the world of perception is accessed through recollection, and recollection is prompted through what he calls the dialectic, which is a process of what he calls collection and division. In other words, we're sorting things out. We're sorting out what we know by examining the concepts that we have. And Plato is, well, he's the first rationalist. We call, the rationalists are like Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, that usually, and the empiricists are the Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And the mistake that I think Plato would say these two schools of thought are making is that they are eliminating the other, and they're both part of what is necessary. And he thinks this is demonstrable through the Meno. It's demonstrable that we need both in order to comprehend the universe. You can't eliminate recollection, and you also, if you didn't have recollection, you wouldn't understand anything that's being seen by your eyes. And we're going to return to that idea with Kant, because Kant responds to Hume is an empiricist. He believes all knowledge comes from perception. But Kant says, wait a minute, we wouldn't understand these perceptions unless there was a structure. And I'm going to use the metaphor I'm going to use for that as an operating system. So you can show all the images you want to a digital camera, but unless you feed that into a computer that analyzes what it's seeing, it will just be a bunch of pixels, and there won't be any ability to identify anything you're seeing. Going back to the idea of a child learning what language means, a child also has the ability at a very early age to distinguish things that are very difficult to teach a computer or artificial intelligence. For example, if you take and this is a well-known problem in artificial intelligence, trying to get like the self-driving Waymo and Tesla trying to get their cars to identify what they're looking at. Some things are very important, like, for example, a person. You want to know that if there's a person in front of you, you shouldn't hit it. You want it to know that. So it has to identify a person. Well, what does a person look like? And a child has no problem at all with this, but it's not that easy to tell a computer, or for a computer to learn what a person is as opposed to a car, to make that distinction. Even if the person is standing still, you could say, well, if it's moving, watch out for it. But a person could be standing stock still. And so what are you going to tell? And it's this shape. Well, it could be a picture of a person. Anyway, these things are easy for a child, very easy for a child to distinguish, and very difficult for a computer. I used to use the example of a tree in winter as opposed to a coat rack. If you have a coat rack that's a pole with some things sticking out from it, getting a computer to distinguish between that and a tree in winter with all the leaves gone, that's not that easy to describe, but a kid won't have any problem with it. It knows that's not a tree. It knows it's a coat rack. Anyway, these are the kind of things that Plato, well, not those things specifically, the kinds of things that Plato notices that we correctly understand without any trouble, that we don't have the background to understand, or the enough sampling to understand. All right, but we understand them because of the working together of the world of forms that we perceive through recollection and the world of perception. So he doesn't deny the validity of either of those things, which is what the rationalists and the empiricists try to do. They say, well, it's all this or all that. Plato doesn't do that. Okay, another theme in the Republic, very famous one, is the three parts of the soul. Plato lists the three parts of the soul as the rational, the passionate, and the appetitive. And he compares the three parts of society, which would be the guardians are the rational people, or this is in an ideal society. The guardians are the rational part of the society. And by the way, he thinks women are just as capable of being guardians as men, which is a very radical departure from normal practice in Greek society. There are no Greek city-states that are run by women. It doesn't happen. There are a few prominent women characters in the ancient world, but none of them are leaders of the Greek city-states. Or as far as I know, well, there were women pharaohs. There were female pharaohs. I don't know if there was ever a female a female ruler of, say, Phoenicia or Babylon. I don't know. I'm not well versed in those societies. Anyway, the three parts of the soul are the government part, or the civilization part, or the city part. Would be at the top are the guardians, who are rational. The guardians live a kind of monk-like life and can't profit from their decisions, and they are raised to be well, first of all, selected from an early age for their talent in mathematics, and they are trained in logic and mathematics and reason, basically, and they would be the ideal leaders of the Republic. And this corresponds in your mind to the ideal leaders of your life, or the leader of your life is the rational part of the soul. The passionate part of the soul is what prompts you to do things, and in Plato's Republic, those are represented by soldiers. They don't behave according to rationality. They behave according to honor, and the honor is based on the obedience to the guardians, who are the rational part of the soul. But they have the passion to withstand any temptation that might occur because of the appetitive part of the soul, and they will do the honorable thing, and they also care about reputation and public accomplishment. And then the lowest part of the soul is the appetitive, which is everybody else, the groundskeepers and clerks and artisans and sculptors. Those are all represent the appetitive part of the soul. In other words, what gets society through the day, the garbage men, the people that take care of business and do all the tasks that are necessary, that is represented by the appetitive part of the soul. And in the human being, the appetitive part of the soul is obvious. It's, sleep, eat, reproduce, to take care of your physical body. Now, when we get to the Christians, an interesting thing that I think is very attractive about Platonism, as opposed to Christianity, is these are all necessary. When you get to Augustine, you're going to find a guy who wants to eliminate all temptation to follow your appetites. It's like Southern Baptists, don't do anything that is fun or pleasing, because that just leads you away from God. This is actually what Augustine believed, by the way. He thought any kind of thing that was like spicy food, or certainly dance and music and anything that was pleasurable, would lead you away from God. It was sin and temptation. So that the Christians are more bipolar, or they are dualists in a moral sense that Plato isn't. Plato doesn't distinguish the three parts of the soul in terms of their moral value. It's rather intellectual value. The appetites don't know what's good for them. So the appetites would lead you to be a heroin addict, or to eat too much, or to be a sex addict, or just be lazy, because that's what your appetite tells you to do. That's what the appetites would do. But Plato says they are necessary. Without the appetites, you wouldn't survive. Whereas Augustine wants to denigrate them. Yeah, Meredith.
Well, Tony, so appetitive and appetite have the same root, right? So you're talking about people who are appetitive are the ones who do what's necessary to run life, to make the world conform to what we need it to be in order for life to go on. I mean, garbage collectors, whatever. So why is that? Why would those two words be from the same root? Can you explain?
Yeah, I think so. The appetites are what fulfills your physical needs. You can put it that way. If you didn't have any appetite to eat, you'd die. If the people who take care of the food supply didn't do what they need to do, the society would die. So the people who are fulfilling the appetitive role in society are completely necessary for your survival. They're not irrelevant. They're not immoral. They're completely necessary. Just the same way that in your soul, remember, Socrates is saying that the soul and the society have the same structure, this three-part structure. And so if you lost your desire to eat, you wouldn't survive. And neither would society if the people that provide those things didn't do what they needed to do. Where'd she go? Oh, there you are. The page moves around. You move around. Does that make sense, Meredith? Or
Yeah, that makes sense.
to
a degree.
well, look, we can't empirically justify what Plato's doing. He's saying that the soul is divided into three, and so is the society. Well, that's kind of random. I could say four. How about 9 parts? He doesn't have any justification for making this specific organization of the soul or the society, but it is the one he's laid out as being ideal. Laurel, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Where does Socrates fit into this? Does he put Socrates in one of these categories, or is Socrates outside? Is Socrates a guardian?
Socrates as a
outside the system.
No, he's not a guardian. Well, first of all, Plato doesn't in the Republic say any living person is one of these people. He doesn't.
Right,
He specifically says this doesn't exist. What I'm saying, huh?
He creates, he describes a world in which it's very structured and imagines that, but he observes a world in which there are gadflies or teachers or people, as it were, who are they sort of part of the rational part of the system, challenging people to think?
Well,
challenging-
again, I just have to say that this is his ideal picture of society. He's not describing society as it exists. He's describing it as it should be. And I'll get to that in a minute. I think Peter's going, what are you talking about here? But
No.
I wanted to say something. So I wanted to ask, where do the artists fit in? Because they're not necessary for the daily life of the society.
Appetitive.
I mean,
well,
repetitive, but how can you justify that? Because we're not necessary.
Well, Plato's view of artists is very controversial. It's one of the things that people don't like about the Republic, because he wants to outlaw the artists, and the reason is the outlaw
Sounds like the United States right now.
The reason is artists are appealing to the appetites, the emotions, according to Plato. And he differs. Aristotle has a much better, in my opinion, view of what art is than Plato does. But Plato is concerned that artists, and bear in mind again that Plato viewed the democracy being moved by passion to execute Socrates and to invade Syracuse. Two terrible mistakes that were prompted by the crowd getting whipped up into a frenzy and doing something irrational. So he considers that art, the art of like speech making or acting or whatever art is. It appeals to the emotions, not to the rational part of the soul. And I haven't really gotten to what the balance of all this is supposed to be yet. So I'm just trying to describe the various parts. So the appetitive part is we share with animals, for example. All living things have, even plants, I guess. I'm not sure he ever says that, but he would certainly agree that all animals have the appetitive part of the soul. The other two parts of the soul are probably not shared by animals. In other words, animals probably don't act. The passions are different from the appetites in the sense that imagine a soldier on duty. He's doing the right thing, even if he's very uncomfortable and real hungry. He's going to do the right thing. That's because he's a member of the passionate part of society that is motivated by honor to do the right thing, not to fulfill his desires, right? And so the passionate part of the soul is also necessary for society. All these three parts are necessary. They're not, Plato isn't bad-mouthing or denigrating any of the three parts. They're all necessary. And then the guardians, like I say, they've been raised from young people to be rational and to make rational decisions. And then harmony, and once again, this is the macrocosm and the microcosm. Harmony occurs in society when all of these parts of the soul are fulfilling their proper role. And so when it's necessary to do something honorable, so we all have these three parts of us. It's just that the guardian part of the rational part hasn't been developed as highly by, say, every street cleaner and pizza chef as it has by those who are rational. And I don't think Plato means technical people. This is kind of gets into the elitist accusation. These people are not trained highly in, say, science or something like that, but they'd be highly educated and rational and wise. That's the idea. So they'd be making judgments, and you should be making judgments as a person that are based on rationality. And I don't think that's as far from common sense. It's just, don't get addicted to heroin. What's telling you that? Well, it's not your appetitive part. And it may not even be your your passionate part. It might be your rational part telling you not to do that. Barry, yeah.
Yeah, so would it be correct? It seems like the implication of this is that since the guardians have to also have an appetite part, or they wouldn't survive and so on, is it sort of the implication that as you move up the line, the hierarchy of these three ideas, that the higher you go, they have subjugated the lower appetite to a higher value of action or rationality. Is that correct?
I don't think, but I could be corrected if somebody has gone over the Republic in great detail. I don't recall Plato using the word higher or lower. It's more like the idea is that each part is doing its job. And of course, as you say, the rational part should be ruling the other two parts. In other words, you can't be honorable and be doing the right thing as a soldier if you're a Nazi prison guard. And if you had a rational guardian telling you what to do, that wouldn't be your job. You would never be doing something, never be assigned to do something that was your duty, that was not wise and good. That wouldn't
I'm
happen.
just suggesting that there's an implied hierarchy here, because the people in the top realm must possess the attributes of the other two realms, but have subjugated them to a higher ideal. So there is an implied hierarchy to these things in terms of.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's just that I think Plato's careful not to denigrate any of them, which is different from Christians, and it's also different from, may I say, capitalists. Capitalists seem to think the people on the top are the smartest. I mean, the richest people are the smartest, or oligarchs think that. Plato doesn't think that, and the guardians are not rich. So I think there's a stratification, but it's what he emphasizes more is harmony. The word he uses is harmony, and that should be a harmony in the soul as well as in the society, and that occurs when everybody is doing the thing they should be doing and not somebody else's job. Like the appetites aren't acting as the guardians. The guardians aren't sweeping the streets. Every part of society is doing what it should be doing, and that is harmony. And I'm just going to end. We're already at an hour here. I'm going to end by saying that the result of this in the society and in the individual should be something the Greeks call eudaimonia. And that just means essentially you is happy or well, or like a eulogy is good talk, happy talk about somebody who's just passed away. That's the same root, logos and you. You means well. So daimonia is demon. So a happy soul or a happy spirit should be the result of, or can only happen when there is a harmony in society. That's when you have a happy society. And in yourself, it can only happen when there's a harmony between the three parts of your soul. So that is his, and I think this is responding to what Peter mentioned about his definition of justice, but it's also a definition of happiness. This is his definition of justice. So it's the harmony between the three parts of the soul, or the harmony between the three parts of society. And that is the only thing that will lead to happiness. If you get an imbalance of any of those three, or a neglect, then you won't have harmony. You'll have.
Does he say that it's possible to move from one part of society to another? Could someone from the appetite side, is it a caste that you're destined to stay in, or could somebody ascend to a higher caste?
Definitely not a caste system, but it's an excellent question. But he doesn't. I can't think of him ever discussing that. Obviously, when you're born, you're not in any of these. You're going to be found to be suitable for being a guardian. As you grow up, you'll be identified as somebody who has talents and wisdom. Now, this would get us into the argument of the founding fathers. What group is responsible for judging who has the aptitude for being a guardian? That's where you run into trouble, as the founders were wise enough to see. But yeah, Barry, there's certainly not an idea of a caste system. This is reflected partly by, I think, in the assembly. I think I've mentioned that when they all get together and decide to go to war, they don't send other people out to go to war. They go home and get their swords and shields, and they go to war, And so there's not a class distinction between the people making the decisions and the people actually fighting.
I think that Gandhi would have thought of himself as a guardian, but he also
agrarian.
Gandhi.
Agrarian.
You said, I know Gandhi, but a guardian or agrarian? I was just trying to.
A guardian, don't you?
A guardian, okay.
But he also believed that everybody had to clean toilets, including him.
Did Gandhi, I'm not as familiar with Gandhi as I should be, but did Gandhi believe in the Hindu caste system?
I don't know.
I mean, he visited or associated with the untouchables, but did he believe the caste system should be eliminated because it's part of traditional Hinduism?
No, he did not believe it should be eliminated. And B.R. Ambedkar, who represented the untouchables and respected Gandhi, I think really disagreed very outspokenly with him on that point. He wanted the caste system destroyed. And, Gandhi was radical in some ways, but he was also a Brahmin. And I think he kind of took the caste system, not for granted, but he thought that kind of tradition should be kept up. I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure about the conflict between him and Ambedkar, who really did want to get rid of the caste system.
So he must have believed it was immutable.
I don't know.
Immutable.
I don't know enough about Gandhi either, but that wasn't where he was. It was the British Empire and what he saw as the corruptions of the modern world that he really set himself against. I don't know how much of a reformer he was about the Hindu tradition. We may wish he was, but I don't know that he was.
Of course, in Hinduism, that's by birth too. There was nothing like that in Plato's Republic, where you're born into the guardian caste or you're born into the passionate caste. There's nothing like that in Plato that I can recall at all. So that's not
some idea of breeding people for the three groups. It's been a while since I read the Republic. I don't react with horror to this, but I think it's an interesting
no, I think
problem.
I think the guardians can tell you who to marry, but I haven't thought about that for a long time. The guardians have a lot of power, and people don't like Plato because it's an authoritarian system. The state decides on your education. It decides on that takes your kids away when they're very young and puts them in a state institution, much like we do. And I'm quite certain it doesn't revolve around birth, though. Now, citizenship in Athens, I'm not sure Plato ever addresses this. I think citizenship in Athens may I'm not sure if you can become a citizen if you're foreign born in Athens. I kind of doubt it.
I think also women cannot be citizens.
They can't participate in the political life in real life, but Plato doesn't say that. Plato, in the ideal world, Plato doesn't represent the reality of Greek society. This is all idealism. So he thinks they can be guardians. In his world, they can be guardians. In the real world of Greece, no, they're not going to be guardians. All right. Well, gee, I think that's long enough. This has been really great. And we'll continue with Plato next time. I'm going to, gee, maybe I should send you, have I sent you the symposium yet?
Yes,
I did that.
quite a while ago.
Oh, okay. Things have gone slower than I expected. You might want to read that. What I haven't sent you the entire symposium. This is long enough. What I sent you, all it is Diotima's statement about what love is. And Diotima, just to give you an introduction, is the only woman who appears in all of Platonic dialogues. I think a couple of others are mentioned, but she not just participates, she's the featured speaker, and she's also a sorceress. So on both those counts and on several others, she's a very peculiar source for Platonic wisdom. She's a woman and not even a guardian type or educated or mathematical type woman. She's a sorceress who is listed as somebody who, or described as somebody who held off the plague for 10 years. So that she has supernatural powers. So she's a very strange character to appear in a Platonic dialogue, but she's right at the center of this one. And we will mainly be covering what she says. So if you want to read the Diotima thing, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too, for next time. So enough of me. Anybody else have remarks or comments or questions? Longer than I planned to go on today, but that tends to happen with Plato. So if nothing else, nobody else has any comments. That's yeah.
I have a couple.
Oh,
I
good.
had the pleasure or non-pleasure of being out in Claremont last weekend, where it kind of rained on. But I went to reception, and one of the professors I met was a linguist, and I mentioned the idea of the sort of universal grammar, and she said, "Well, the research is going the other way. You know, that was an interesting research, but the thought process about that concept is starting to, they felt like it doesn't accommodate, it was trying to put a lot of things in one bucket, right? That they did think that the research is going in the other, not that the thought is different, but the research is going in the direction of maybe we're not accommodating for how people acquire language in different cultures. In other words, so that's basically it's an open question. So I just thought I'd kind of bring that to bear a little bit because for example, her research is in the area of tip of the tongue. In other words, I remember her name, but I can't. It's on the tip of my tongue.
I thought you were going to say her research is focused on the tip of the tongue.
Well,
no, her
yeah.
name.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
No, but it's that same to a certain extent. Kids do learn. They may not have a huge grammar, but they're constantly being reflected again. So my 14-month-old grandson is here, and he just sort of, reflects back, and he because develop language in the total, you develop the little pieces. But you're right. So anyway, I just want to introduce that. And I had two other quick things. Sorry, I'm holding this up.
No.
I remember you said in the dialogue that sometimes it seems like you're going all the way around the rosemary bush and we don't really get an answer. But the value of that is the fact that we've done the inquiry. And it's interesting, my field of law is actually intellectual property and the internet. And trade secrets, it's a big deal to know what you don't know. That's a very valuable thing, that to do that inquiry and say, we don't know the answer to that question, or that didn't work, or that sort of stuff. So just, so which kind of is a different way of looking at that. Yeah, we didn't come to a conclusion on that, but we did the inquiry that we don't have a complete answer, but we know more about what we know or don't know, which is, I think, the point of the dialogues, is it not?
Yeah, that's the state of aporia that Socrates refers to. That you go through this whole in the Euthyphro, for example, you go through this whole thing, and then you don't know anything, but actually you do know something more than you did when you started, which is, well, that didn't work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and that's that it is worth knowing, I think. By the way, in the Euthyphro and the Meno and a lot of Platonic dialogues, the uh, opinions expressed by Euthyphro and Meno are conventionally accepted ideas today. I mean, I had to transfer Euthyphro from ancient Greece to Christianity, but it's the same structure. The belief system has the same structure and raises the same issues. So these guys are presented not as weirdos, but actually representing the common person, what they think. But yeah, that and back to Chomsky and the universal grammar. My impression is this is a hot topic in linguistics right now as we speak. It's not something that's been resolved either for or against Chomsky. I think what they're doing is, I don't think anybody dismisses him out of hand. I think what they're trying to do is resolve things that they find that don't quite fit that description, as you would do in any science. You know that Newton, did a pretty good job, but there was something out here that you didn't know. I think it's that kind of stage.
I think it's also not an either. It's not an either or black and white thing. I think there's a pretty good agreement that there are underlying brain structures that are crucial for language beyond, mama, papa, or dogs knowing words. That humans have brains that are structured for language beyond what dogs say possess. But exactly how that's put together and how much of grammar, as it were, how much of the structure of language is really organic in the brain. I think that's like as you say, we know more than we used to, but we
Also, Neil, you said something I wanted to hit on, and that was I use the large language model as saying what a computer does with a blank slate, and it couldn't do that. And what you pointed out was something very true, which is the large language models don't exist in the real world. So you can't point to something and say, or a large language model can't observe you doing something and then calling it something. It isn't perceiving the world. It is just using purely symbols for the world. So it can't know. So the advantage of the kid or the child learning language is not is that he is living in a real world where those words have meanings that he can see the use of. Even so, I think Chomsky thinks it's too much organization to be learned as quickly as it is in all examples of humanity, all societies.
Yeah. Although you have go ahead, Barry.
When you mentioned earlier about the songbirds, the critical period for learning a bird song, I just want to point out that I ran into that concept with my son because he had 2 neurosurgeries before he was a year old, and his language skills were very slow to develop. And it was pointed out to us by psychiatrists who were working with him that the trauma of those operations may have probably disrupted the critical path of language learning, and it has persisted in a language processing deficit that he still has today. So that same critical path idea exists with human language learning as well.
But Barry, can you give us an example? Because I've spoken to Ben before, and I didn't notice any weirdness about his comprehension or his rhythm or anything like that. I've known friends of mine who have more trouble than Ben had. So
Well,
can you-
he's learned kind of to pass, pretty well. But when he was young, he couldn't remember and keep straight the names of his relatives or the names of certain objects. He would struggle to get them for years, even after adolescence. He was always had difficulty with phone conversations because he couldn't process what the person was saying quickly enough to be able to respond. And so he would just be faltering in being able to say anything. And he still has difficulty in situations where there's a lot of conversation going on around him. And he just kind of, his mind just freezes when there's too much linguistic input for him to process. So it's evident, but he can pass for normal pretty easily.
he can pass.
Yeah.
That's all very interesting. And of course, as far as not remembering names and things, we're all advancing to that stage ourselves.
But interestingly enough, he is always also, and as he struggled with all these things, he's always had a compensatory talent for observation. He observes things very astutely and remembers what he's seen, and his topographical sense. He can navigate. He remembers, what we're driving someplace, and I'm always lost, and he always knows where we're going, which is interesting.
That is interesting. Wow. Oops. Anybody else want to jump in here and enlighten us? Well, okay, it's just one of the highlights of my week to get together with you guys and talk about things that I can't talk about with anybody else on earth. So it's a big pleasure for me. And so we'll continue with Plato again next time. I'm sorry we're spending so much time on him, but it really is the groundwork for all the rest of philosophy. So if that's frustrating you, I have a plan, kind of.
Plato is worth it.
So I have a quick question. So how did the young man do? You end up in Tupelo, not Memphis, and you took him there for his surgery on his foot.
He's not young.
Yeah, he's in his early 60s.
He's not young.
That's
The
young.
operation on his ankle went okay. I'm not sure how he is right now.
Oh, okay. Well, that's young to us,
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care. Have a good week.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Tony, thank you.
All right.
Okay.